I'm Alex, and these are the 8 books I read in January. Quick rundown of what I thought of them, and then a little update on where I am with the reading goals. Pretty much nowhere, but what can you do? So first up was Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas by Hunter S. Thompson, which is a hard book to describe. It is a drug trip. You're not really sure what the story is. It's semi-autobiographical, with Hunter S. Thompson playing the role of a journalist travelling around with his attorney. And that's the general plot. They're going to first give a summary of a bike race. They're first reporting on a bike race in the Las Vegas desert, and second is attending a drug conference, believe it or not. It is a very funny book. Some of the passages with the hitchhiker, and also when Hunter S. Thompson describes how to deal with when you're caught speeding, are very funny, and thoroughly enjoyed them. I suppose that the book's really about what it is to be an outsider, somebody who doesn't conform to society, and it's almost a very exaggerated way of how society looks to the outsider, with some glimpses into how society sees the person who's on the outside. I think those types of books, those perspectives on the people looking in, are very interesting, and how the nonconformist digests what we perhaps would see as normal, those living within the, accepted boundaries of society. So I thoroughly enjoyed that perspective. Maybe I'm thinking too much about it. Maybe it is just a straight up drug trip and what happens there. But I think it does have that philosophical element of what it means to not conform, to be an outsider. And it's packaged in some very funny prose, some very witty prose. It's the only thing I've read by Hunter S. Thompson, but now I do think that I would check out more of his work. And if any suggestions on where to go next, then do let me know. Next was Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance by Robert Pirsig, which again is not what you'd traditionally imagine a book to be. It's a story essentially of a boy and his father travelling across the, west of America. And it's interspersed with these philosophical elements, predominantly drawing upon the ancient Greek philosophers. It was actually the book which informed my goal of wanting to read more of the ancient Greek philosophers this year. I was intrigued by it. I thought it gave a really good representation of their thoughts, particularly on the idea of quality, and trying to come up with a more rigid definition of it, where it's something that we can obviously identify, and there seems to be a somewhat universal appreciation for what quality is. But how do we define that? How do we break it down and really understand it? And how do we replicate it is the bigger question that surrounds it. I would say that it's got a fairly slow start, and I think it only really becomes, well, at least for me, very interesting in the final quarter. But I do think it was worth it to get there, and I think all the build-up in the first 3 quarters adds to how touching of a story it is, particularly with the epilogue section added by the author. It's a very heartwarming story about a frankly quite complex relationship between a father and son, and you do get these hints throughout the book that there's just something not quite right in their relationship and within themselves as well. But overall, great read, thought-provoking, very interesting, and if you are interested in ancient Greek thought and classical thought as well, then this is a book that I would recommend. Third book for January was Paradise Lost by John Milton. The main idea behind this book is to justify the ways of God to man, and through that it's a retelling of Genesis and the fall of Lucifer into hell after his rebellion against God. The book, I suppose, boils down to a quote by Satan, which is that it's better to rule in hell than serve in heaven. That surmises a real question that we have, which is one between servitude and freedom. Or perhaps we could better phrase servitude as responsibility and duty, and a respect for a higher authority, which, to be honest, Satan is somewhat expecting of his followers. So there is a question of, do you hate tyranny, or do you just hate it when you're not the tyrant? And really you want to be the one who's wielding authority, which perhaps it is that in regards to Satan. As an extension of that idea of duty, responsibility and freedom, there's the idea when we turn to Adam and Eve of consequences. And you have the free will to do what you want, but you have to bear in mind that there'll be consequences to your actions. And how will you face them? Are you prepared to live up to them? Potentially not at the start for Adam and Eve. Eventually they reconciled and were. But we have those 2 core themes running through it. one being of freedom and one being of responsibility. It's packaged as a heroic epic, in a poetry format, and I didn't find it the easiest to read at the start. I think the more you read it, get into it, the use of the language, the style, the easier it comes to read. And I would recommend persevering if you do find that you're not finding it as easy to read at the start. There was another epic poem that I read in January, which was a lot easier, but I think Paradise Lost is one that is worth reading, does get easier. And again, as with the theme of these books and most of the books that I read, there is an interesting philosophical discussion within there, and one that the ideas are presented. Satan is presented and his ideas are presented very firmly. It's not a straw man, it's, if anything, a steel man. And some critics have said that rather than justifying the ways of God to man, it was rather justifying Satan's position and making him more attractive. And I will say that he has some very good lines, and he is a compelling speaker. But perhaps that's the point. That was why he was so successful in his endeavour in Genesis. Interesting book, no sort of religious need going into it. I think it's just a good philosophical discussion. And if you're interested in that, interested in those ideas, then it is a book that I would recommend. The next book for January was Les Miserables by Victor Hugo. Now, I think this might be my new favourite book. Maybe. And that's sort of competing with Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, some other great writers. But it was just such a good book. And there was a lot of exposition in it, and I didn't care for it. I didn't enjoy learning about the history of the Paris sewer system. Great, it was fine to include it, but not for me. Didn't enjoy that. I don't think that I necessarily agree with the thesis of the book and the Hobbes-Rousseau argument that is set up and presented. I don't think I agree with Victor Hugo. In fact, I know I don't agree with Victor Hugo. And in spite of all of that, and especially in this edition, which is the Penguin Clothbound Classics edition, there were a lot of typos. Editing, misprinting, poor. And you can also see the colours begin to fade on the spine, just there. So it was quite a rough ride for it, to be honest. I was noticing more problems within this edition of the Penguin Clothbound Classics than the other ones. And, I expect there to be some printing errors and some editing errors. It's a 1,200 page book, but it's a premium product. That's how it's being marketed. And I have noticed fading with other copies, particularly my copy of Anna Karenina is doing quite badly in terms of the colouring on the spine. But just a lot of editing and printing mistakes that I didn't find in other Clothbound Classics by Penguin. So that was a disappointment. Exposition didn't care for, thesis didn't really relate to, but the story, the characters are just phenomenal. The character of Fantine, it was the last few paragraphs of her story were just so devastating and so well written. It was really a similar style of prose to Hemingway, in that it was very blunt, punchy. It didn't add any embellishment to what was being said, and I think it had all the more impact because of that. And then the love story between Marius and Cosette was it was gorgeous. It was probably the most beautiful romance that I've read, in its tenderness, in the subtlety of the prose and the purity of it. It was just so well done, and it was perfectly set up. And then obviously the character of Valjean was so compelling. And in fact, the inner turmoils that you have throughout the book within all the characters is just so well written. You get a lot of that in Dostoevsky, and I think it's more raw in Dostoevsky, and you see the toll on the character more. But I just found myself enjoying Hugo's style more. I enjoyed the way he set up conflict, the way it was debated. Perhaps not laboured as much as Dostoevsky, and not as philosophically or psychologically interesting as Dostoevsky, but for me it was great. I really enjoyed it. I'm not so compelled though to look at Hugo's other work. I'm quite happy with Les Miserables, and it's a great book. I really do recommend it. It's perhaps, no, I was going to say it's perhaps not as easy to read as some of the other sort of longer books such as Tolstoy's, but I think it is. Just be warned that there are breaks in the story for periods of exposition, and some of them are relevant to the story. Actually, I just remembered there was exposition on Waterloo. That was actually great. that was really good. That was the one piece of exposition that I really enjoyed, was the one talking about Waterloo. And actually it compelled me to buy a book on Waterloo just to get another account of it, or a more detailed account. That was great. But I am a big fan of the era of the Napoleonic Wars. But I just remember reading the exposition about the sewer and just thinking, why am I reading like 10, 15 pages about the Paris sewer system? I don't need that right now. So I didn't enjoy that, but okay, some of it was great, some of it was good, and overall, just a fantastic book. Really recommend it, and perhaps a new favourite. Next, we have Coming Up for Air by George Orwell, which is perhaps not one of his best known works. It's not Animal Farm, it's not 1984, but it is a very good book. And you see the fingerprints of 1984. You see how Orwell's ideas evolved and became what they were in 1984, and also to an extent in Animal Farm. I believe it was written in 1939, and some of the predictions that Orwell makes about authoritarianism in society, and not in Nazi Germany, but within British society, were startlingly accurate. Obviously, with hindsight, we can see how it all played out, but for him to see that at this time, in 1939, was very impressive. It's a funny book, essentially about escaping the monotony of life and escaping the pressures of society and the tightening grip of society. Being freer, being independent, and doing what you want to do, not what is expected of you. It was a very good book, very witty writing, and interesting just to see the philosophical ideas of George Orwell develop, and to get a contemporary idea of what people were thinking at that time and what was being written at that time before and during the outbreak of the Second World War. So it's very interesting. That great story as well. I think if you're a fan of Orwell, you've read 1984, you found those ideas interesting, I'd move on to this. It's going backwards in Orwell's chronology, but it is well worth it. It's always interesting to see how an author develops their writing style, but also their ideas. And this is a great place to do that with Orwell. Highly recommended. Next is Down and Out in Paris and London by George Orwell as well. Similarly to Coming Up for Air, it does have the early development of 1984, primarily in how language can be used to manipulate thought, and also how to break someone, how to keep people down, and making sure that they have no spirit, no pride. He does this particularly in his assessment of and ethnographic experience with people who are down and out, the homeless, and how they are broken as people, which is a theme that continues into 1984, and which was a theme of the 20th century. That's where the similarities with 1984 and Animal Farm and also Coming Up for Air end. I would say that where Coming Up for Air is on that more authoritarian tilt of Orwell's writing, Down and Out in Paris and London aligns itself more with Road to Wigan Pier. Both are interesting avenues that Orwell takes. This is just more focused on poverty and first-hand accounts of those experiencing it. Still a good book. Preferred Coming Up for Air, and I think that side of Orwell's writing. But if you read Road to Wigan Pier, enjoyed it, this is a continuation of those thoughts. And if you want to see the other side of Orwell's writing, I think that I preferred this to Road to Wigan Pier. Road to Wigan Pier was written more in a non-fiction social history style, whereas Down Now in Paris and London has a narrative thread that's running through it, while it is still a first-hand account. The seventh book for January is The Song of Roland by Anonymous. Well, no one knows who wrote it. It was written in the late 11th century and is set in 778, so in the time of Charlemagne, and essentially follows Charlemagne's crossing from Spain through the Pyrenees back to France, and the exploits of his rear guard, which was led by Roland, who was holding off the Saracen forces who were in pursuit. It's like Paradise Lost in the sense that it's a heroic epic, so written as poetry, but it was a lot more accessible. I found this incredibly easy to read for heroic poetry. I mean, really credit to the translator because they did a fantastic job, and perhaps the original author. Very well written, very accessible. And if you haven't read any heroic poetry but are looking for a place to start, then this could be a good place. It's not too long, very accessible, and, you know, aside from a place like the Divine Comedy or Paradise Lost or any of Homer's works, I think that this is very accessible, culturally and historically relevant. So if you're looking for that, you know, if you don't want to miss out on that, I think this is a good place to start. It's interesting, and I bought it actually because in Les Miserables they mentioned the Paladins, who were sort of the equivalent of the Knights of the Round Table, but to Charlemagne as opposed to Arthur. So I was reading that to get really an idea of the French notions of chivalry at the time of the 11th century, so in the medieval period. And well, it does give that, and it's quite, there's nothing groundbreaking within the ideas of chivalry. They are what you'd expect. You know, bravery in the face of danger, sacrificing oneself, having that pride and that glory for your own country. And they were interesting read, nothing overly profound. It was just an enjoyable read, a nice insight into that time period, especially from a French perspective, and as I've said, a good introduction to heroic poetry. So, the eighth and final book that I read in January was Menno. So it's packaged here in one volume with Protagoras, or the Sophists. But I only read Menno. I read Protagoras on the 1st of February. Alas, didn't manage to fit in January. But I'm counting them as two separate books because they can be bought in separate volumes, so that's just, you know, just where it is. So that was the last book that I read. It's Menno, and it's a Socratic dialogue by Plato. So essentially it's set almost as a play, where you have Socrates talking. In this instance, the prime raconteur of Socrates is Menno, and Plato is writing this as though he was giving a recount of what was said between them, but you know, word by word, verbatim account. The main idea is being good, the nature of man, and whether being good is something that can be taught. So the way they conceptualize that is being good knowledge-based, in which case it can be taught, or is it not? So it goes back and forth in attempts to define being good primarily, so then that it can advance onto can it be taught or not, because you have to know what it is before you can teach it, of course. It was an interesting and thought-provoking discussion, and one that I think carried on quite nicely from Les Miserables and the ideas that were presented within there. I didn't necessarily agree with everything that was presented and the arguments that were accepted. I think it has some of the same problems that you find within economics of the rational decision maker and the logician who thinks through everything before they make a decision and before they act. And it just doesn't take into account human nature. And that's the problem, is that it's overlooking that. I am not finished with it. I've sort of highlighted and picked out the areas that I thought were interesting and which outlined the progression of the dialogue, and I plan to review them at some point in the next week or so. But those are my initial thoughts, that I think it is all well and good, and their discussions around what is good and the teaching of it were satisfactory, and there were some very interesting points that were raised. But to the extent of knowledge is what's lacking, and that is also where it continues in Protagoras. I don't know. I just think it's not realistic enough. It's a more utopian view and theoretical view, which is the point. I mean, it's a philosophical discussion, but the application, the practicality of it, I found were not what I would most want within philosophy. But I do think that people should read the Socratic dialogues, the writings of Plato, as they are very interesting, and there are a lot of truths in there that hold true today as well. Those were the 8 books that I read in January, which according to Goodreads puts me 4 books behind schedule, which is fine. I mean, I only read 1 book last year. In January, I managed to catch up. So if we look at it that way, I'm actually +7, and that's, you know, I'm doing great. That's how I prefer to look at it. In terms of reading modern fiction, I did not. In terms of reading more Shakespeare, I did not. In terms of my final goal, which was to read more of the Greek philosophers, I did, and I'm starting to do that, so that's great. You know, actually attending to the goals that I set and not getting rid of them a couple of weeks later. So very good. We'll see about modern fiction. Still haven't decided on what modern fiction to read. I thought about just looking at the Goodread, the book of the year, and just reading those, seeing how I think about those, but we'll see. Probably primarily going to be continuing with the works of Plato, trying to work through them all now that I'm in that sort of zone. If you want to see the full breakdown of my goals for 2023, then that'll be linked down in the description. Otherwise, this is what I'm up to so far. That is what I read in January, and I'll see you in the next one.